Well, Doug Kearney's here. Hi, Doug.
Hey, how you doing there, Al?
And we are talking about a poem by Yona Harvey.
The Yona Harvey.
The Yona Harvey. And it's a long poem.
It is.
It's longer than we usually do here in Mod Po. And in Sharpened Visions, I think, both.
Yeah. Although we did do the bells in Sharpened Vision.
Wow.
And that's pretty long.
Okay, I take it back. Mod Po, we're into the short poems. But anyway, it's called The Dream District, Origins. So here's my first question.
Yeah.
As you hear it and as you look at it on the page, you see three structures.
Absolutely.
So you got italicized questions.
Indeed.
Then you have Roman or non-italicized short answers. Well, you think answers because following a question, Roman letter, it's got to be an answer, but it's not always answering. It's not always commensurate, but okay. And then on the right side, with a separate flush, mostly flush left, but way tabbed over, you get, you could think of them as like a quick refrain, or you could also think of them as a commentary.
Absolutely, yeah.
Marginal commentary. And it's generally about self-composition, made me. Okay. So how do you deal with, I mean, you personally, Doug, how do you deal with a poem that's, first of all, typographically signaling to you about its juxtapositions? And once you decide that the Roman answers are answers, you begin to try to find answers to questions being posed, and in most cases, they're
not
give you
lining
answers.
up
So
that way.
how do you deal with this?
Well, I mean, one of the things that struck me as I was reading it aloud, as I'd finish one particular sort of sequence of it, I sit there and go like, oh, that was wrong. The whole time I'm looking at...
What was wrong? The way you read it?
Well, there were times where I was posing it as a question even when it wasn't posed as a question. For example, Malcolm X is just a statement. First Lady Obama's is also just a statement.
Right.
And in some ways, my desire to kind of verbally communicate the typography was sort of dictating a certain register. And there's also these moments where you have the question spills over into two lines as opposed to these sort of short single lines.
Right.
Which then, in some cases makes you ask the question, well, should I phrase the entire question as one sort of thing? Or should I interrupt? If we look at or banish him or love, we have I came here too, and we have an M dash, which of course suggests the interruption, so that we can run back to him again or lift him up, and we feel like we've been sort of authorized by that or directed to do that. But we could also imagine I came here too intactness, operating in its own sort of space. So one of the first things about this poem that I think is fascinating is how it kind of takes the columnar approach, which the kind of introductory reading strategy that I have whenever I get to a poem like that is I try reading it all the way across, and then I try reading it vertically to see if it makes sense both ways or what happens. And this one, I think, in a really fascinating way, frustrates that through a kind of reinvention and through a kind of angled sort of response, sort of a fractalized response to some of the questions. And what that does for me when I'm thinking about it based upon not just the structure of this, the form of this particular poem, but the actual content, is it makes me think of a kind of troubling or explosion of antiphonal or call and response forms. We have that almost interview-like left half of the page.
Right.
But that also feels like a call coming out, and the response isn't always, as you pointed out, like a kind of a plumb thing. But it taps into a language, a compositional strategy that reminds me, again, of like call and response, which is oftentimes something that we think of in terms of liturgical music or church music.
Yeah, this certainly begins liturgically.
Yeah,
How about this? So I'm a little, as you know, I'm a little obsessed with trying to close read difficult poems.
Absolutely.
Right. So how about nothing up our sleeves.
No,
we didn't prepare this, right? Okay, so I think it would be fun to explore the juxtapositions that get created. So why don't I pick one to start?
Let's do it.
And I'm going to pick a relatively easy.
Start.
I mean, I think we should start with we should get to a harder one. But So let's go with the second line.
Okay.
The question is, does God have a face? Which is a question that, well, everybody asks, but I think children in particular. I mean, the word origins here suggests, I think, some childhood memories that are going on. We get that. Does God have a face? And the answer is, I came here to live, which is not easy.
Right. Right.
But, and then the word made me, which becomes very important on the right column, follows from my grief made me.
Absolutely.
But we'll just say made me, because that's how you read it. Okay. So how do we get from, is I came here to live any kind of answer to the question, does God have a face?
Well, okay. So if I go wide, and I stretch, we could think about the idea of trying to see the face of God as a kind of a space of annihilation, right? If we go wide, we could say that, does God have a face? And the response to it would be a somewhat almost flip. No, I came here to live. I don't want to see that. So that's one kind of reading that we can.
So I came here to live idiomatically is a little snarky.
It's
like,
a little snarky.
A little bit leave me alone.
Yeah. Like, I'm not trying to see if I came here to actually
I got to do stuff. I got to do day by day.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And also the very realistic, I should say, the theological idea that if you saw the face of God, it would just sort of destroy you. But then there's also the sense that's perhaps less far out. This idea of living, if you are a believer, and this poem at least offers that possibility up of reading the speaker as someone who is tussled with belief, then the idea of the face of God is in everything. So the very act of being here, the very act of being alive, then lets you see the entirety of God's creation, and so you're seeing God in that way.
I could do made me if you want.
Yeah, you want to do made me?
I'll do made me.
Yeah.
So I'm following from what you just said.
Yeah.
So who made me? If we're talking about God, I guess we have to go with God made me, except that this person is alienated, stuck in some things that have happened in the past, lonely sometimes. And made me here comes from my grief made me. So it's almost a pun on creation, because the right column, the third column over, is all about self-making. Right. Or my family history made me, or things that have happened. But so if my grief made me, then fuck you, God. Pardon my French. Does God have a face? I came here to live. My grief made me. You didn't make me. God didn't make me. I was made by what happened to me.
Right. Exactly.
All right, let's do a harder one.
Okay, let's do a harder one.
Here we go. Actually, can we go to another easy one?
Oh, yeah,
All right, it's on page 2, and then we'll go to a hard one.
These are all relative,
Okay,
yeah?
all right. It's going to be 2 lines, Doug.
Let's do it.
Where you left alone.
Okay.
You see me?
Yep.
Where you left alone,
Yep.
the postage stamp yellowed, made me a key hung around my neck.
Right.
You wanted to write letters? When no one was home, I stole inks and papers.
Okay.
I've written in the column Memory of Childhood, and I see origins in the title. So I'm thinking that the speaker, or the multiple selves that Yona Harvey is trying to identify here, there's something happened.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a latchkey kid.
A latchkey kid image, absolutely. Yeah. Right. And then the idea of the postage stamps yellowing, meaning that there was no correspondence going out, right? You wanted to write letters. When no one was home, I stole inks and papers, right? But the letters might be written, but that's not the same thing as sending and mailing them. Yeah. And so that sort of amplifies the loneliness, right? The being alone. If the postage stamps, there's no actual correspondence. Yeah. But there's also something interesting about that, which is to suggest if the postage stamps were available, but unused, and the speaker wants to write letters, enough so that in response they would steal inks and papers, then there is the sense that lack of communication with the outside world was imposed. Like, we have the means by which you could communicate, but
and overcome loneliness.
But for some reason we're not letting you. And so that becomes something interesting when we begin to think about the next line of "Were you ashamed?"
Yeah. I want to
Right.
get to that.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but
But
let's
we'll
stay on this a
stay
little
here
bit
for a minute.
longer. So
Yeah.
so we're here. We're seeing. I mean, I tend to think at this point in the poem, Doug, that this is a. I think it's a portrait of a young writer. I think it's a portrait of a writer as a young girl. And I think even more specifically, because of the next stanza, the portrait of a young black writer. So there's this tradition that's Malcolm X's autobiography being part of that tradition, but way down at the end of that tradition, the tradition that goes back to the 19th century of a smart young person who has no ability to freely express, who is completely hemmed in, and he uses letters, uses letters to self-make.
Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
So the made me, I mean, the fact that this kid was alone, latchkey kid, left to, as you put it, figure out how to communicate to the outside, creates a self that is a written self and stealing.
Right. I mean, Lewis Hyde, calls Frederick Douglass a thief
I'm
of
thinking
language.
Douglas entirely
Right,
here.
exactly,
Right.
exactly.
So now we get to so we get to the next section, which I'll let you riff on immediately. But the thing that's so cool is we get triple juxtapositions within each section. Then we get the juxtaposition from section to section.
Absolutely.
So the work that we just did to identify this child who's become a writer against all odds, we now get to Tina Turner, Malcolm X,
Right.
and Made Me You Black.
Right.
So do you want to?
Right.
I mean, were you ashamed? Answer: Tina Turner.
It's like this kind of this absolute sort of sense of like what I don't even want to call it transcendence. Like I don't necessarily want to think about it like that. But this kind of sense of brazenness, of confidence, swagger, even in the face of a repressive or an oppressive.
So the answer is no, I wasn't ashamed. Tina Turner is a
that
no.
feels like
I'll take
a no.
no for an answer.
That feels like a no right there. And last time I leapt ahead to Were You Ashamed, and now I'm going to be perverse and I'm going to go backwards just a little because it goes back to something that you said when we first started talking about the My Grief Made Me and self-making. Because I want to go back to made me a key hung round my neck. Now, we can read that, of course, as someone made a key for me to hang around my neck. Or we could also read it as I was made into a key that was hung around my own neck.
Oh, God.
And so that idea of coming to a kind of, we were talking about being locked in and not being able to express, when one is able to consider the possibility of sort of self-expression and freeing oneself, right? Then that image really, that just blooms in another fantastic way. But of course, and this is the thing, like we can metonymically assume then that key means to open, but it also means to have the option of opening or locking, unlocking or locking. So it's not necessarily that somebody has used it. It's the presence and the possibility of the choice. And so that to me, I think is really sort of a powerful moment. And when we think about the postage stamps, trailing back up to made me late payments, the payments not going out also then is a reason why the postage stamps might not have been used. So going to the shame, were you ashamed? I get the sense of no. Malcolm X being brought into the conversation immediately as well. These figures who are associated not only with a overcoming a set of circumstances of abuse, limitation, and becoming famous.
The X.
Yeah,
the X.
yeah.
The X is marks the spot of the writer creating himself.
Exactly. And also this sort of mysterious space of what's not spoken and what's not identified.
Yeah.
In the kind of breaks between this left and right columns.
Okay, so I want to invite us to say some larger things about what we think she's accomplishing. I'll start, and then you can
Please.
say what this is. So I'm just overwhelmed by it. I think it's It's amazing. And I think what's happening is that I came here to live is one, I came here to live is one kind of pre-poetic response to the question, who are you, what made you what you are, right? I came here to live. So there is the tradition, there is the history of, from Douglas to Malcolm, there is the history of of black expressiveness being itself liberation. For Douglas, when he was in fact a slave in Virginia, he figured out how to teach himself how to write or whatever. And then there is the familial. There is mom and dad. There's the things they had to do. There's what it was like to be 10, what it was like to be a latchkey kid, if that's the case. There's all that. So there's nurture and there's nurture. There's historical nurture. And both of those things, Doug, brilliantly in this poem, I think, lead to, they're very different. There's the historical, what Cullen was wrestling with, and then there's the particular portrait of the artist as a young girl, young black girl, growing up in a particular family with the memories of the 10-year-old birthday. But the two of them, both of those things lead to a kind of great historical / personal therapeutic consciousness about why writing is the response to these questions one way or other. A string tied to a pencil, I came here to live. I came here in this poem to live, I write to live, I steal the ink and papers to live. So I really admire the way this poem gets us to do the work that is historical and then personal. These are a personal origin story. So I'm talking about two strains that come together to writerliness.
Absolutely.
And of course, this poem just cries out writerliness because of its innovative structure that forces us to do the work.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
That was a little windy, but
No, oh my gosh, that was a good breeze.
Okay, good.
Your
turn.
To echo that, the idea of inheritance. The idea of, I keep thinking of, coming from a long line, right, with the father's strikes at the chemical plant, the picket lines, to a particular rhetoric around resistance.
Yeah.
No scabs, like a union, coming from a union household and what that means, but also coming from a Christian household. So coming here to live, right? And then in the end, we also have, coming to die, right? To being born to die, right? But that death isn't necessarily the end. We get to stay in the material of this world, whether we're talking about like Duncan Hines boxes of cake batter, cake mix, these historical figures, all the furniture of the poem. We end with, how can it be that she's gone and I live, made me a paper plate licked clean. That sense of a surface of paper where one would write, would cast, right? Would project a particular experience onto there. Here the paper plate, through this tasting of what is now gone, a sweetness that is now gone, becomes clean and wiped away.
So it's dutiful. I mean, it is, I cleaned my plate, I ate my food, I did, right? If there's any kind of precarity in this family, it's important that she remembers. But paper plate split on the line gives us, made me a paper, which is the paper is an ink.
Right.
This is the making, made me a writer. Mama made me a writer. The therapist or whoever it is, or the superego is saying, do you miss her deeply? And then you didn't quote that line, and then how can it be that she's gone and I live, which is simple shame, simple like guilt, survivor guilt.
Right, absolutely.
And she, I assume, since we've had a reference to mamas, I assume this is the speaker's mom.
I think that within the space of the poem, that is what we're given.
Yeah.
I think that we're given that to think through. And whether or not that's, autobiographical in that moment or not, Yona Harvey's previous book grapples with the death of her sister.
Could
but
be the sister.
It could be the sister, but that's why I think it's really important to talk about what's given to us in the body of the poem.
Right.
Because the poem doesn't talk about the sister in that way, in any specific way. And we're given these moments, like for example, this goes out to all the baby mamas. That's a line, I think, from Outkast's Miss Jackson. Like, this goes out to all the baby's mamas.
So the baby mamas are young women who have
Young
kids?
women who have kids.
Right.
And
so that sounds like sister.
it could be a younger sister.
Yeah.
Though, again, not necessarily autobiographical.
But you wouldn't think of a parent, you wouldn't think of the shame of outliving a parent.
Outliving
You would
a
think of
parent.
the shame of outliving a sibling.
Right. But then we had, but where I wanted to really kind of think about with this ending goes back to the kind of flexibility, the hinging quality of made me, right? Because if we say made me a paper plate licked clean, made me a paper plate licked clean, and we think of the speaker as then being the actor of licking the plate clean, that's one reading. But if we think about it as the speaker is the plate, the paper plate that has been licked clean, again, we have this kind of sense of all the sweetness being sort of taken away. All the sweetness being taken away, but also all of the mess. This is the frosting, the granulated, the crystallized sugar, all of that's now gone. And what we have instead is a blank, clean plate, but we've lost this other thing. And so that becomes another kind of loss, another kind of, let's say, absence before its time. It could be a kind of a loss of innocence. The gesture of it, though, there's also something, that's slant rhymes with being consumed in that moment. And so what this poem talks about losing, right, I think is fascinating.
Doug, thank you so much.
Thank you so
This
much,
was really, really great. Appreciate it.
Thank you.